Hey everyone, Shaun Stevenson here, author of the Throne series, and today I'm wrapping up my review of the 3 books that I had gotten in the Secret of the Hidden Scrolls series. This is book number 3, The Great Escape, which I need to take back to the library. So, I'm reviewing it today because I finished reading it, so I can take it back to the library and turn it back in. I don't know if I'm going to read any more of these. I'm just going to say from the outset. They have been kind of interesting books to read. They're not the worst, but they're not the best. I really have struggled reading through these. Like, this one took me a while to get through, and it's not that long. And there's so much white space on a page, and there's pictures. But this book just took me a while. Now, I will say this is probably the best of the 3 of these, and it is the 3rd book. So it kind of makes sense that, an author would grow as they write a series, and they would get better as they wrote it and figure out their tropes, all those sorts of things. But okay, let me set up what this book is about. This is, like I said, the 3rd book in the Secret of the Hidden Scrolls series, The Great Escape. Each one of these books is about these 2 kids, Peter and Mary, who are staying with their great uncle Solomon, who has this mysterious basket of glowing scrolls. And when they break the seal on one of the scrolls, it takes them back in time to a Bible story from the Bible. So in this book, they go back in time to Exodus during the time of the 10 plagues on Egypt. So Peter and Mary, they go back in time to this point in time with the 10 plagues on Egypt, where they meet Moses. They also meet Pharaoh's daughter, which is an interesting thing for them to do. They meet Pharaoh's daughter, so they end up staying with Pharaoh's daughter throughout most of the plagues, which is an interesting thing I will talk about in a minute. And then they go through the whole story of the 10 plagues, and then they finally get all the way through to where they escape with the Hebrews to the Promised Land through the Red Sea, like the biblical story as shown in movies like the 10 Commandments or from Exodus. So, this book was, like I said, an interesting one to read. It took me a while to get through. It had some very interesting things, and again, I feel like one of the weaknesses of this series is that it's unfortunately not very well researched. There are some pieces of Egyptology and Egypt mythology that are not presented in this book that I feel like should have been presented in order to round out the story. What do I mean by that? There has been a ton of research done about Egypt, obviously, and there's also been a ton of research done into the stories of Exodus. And I feel like the author didn't spend much time with that research, but just went for a face value narrative and kind of took the story from Exodus, put Peter and Mary into it, added in some action, and went from there. And there are some great action scenes. Peter and Mary are kind of bland characters, but Pharaoh's daughter is a very interesting character that they meet, and also their interactions with Moses are kind of interesting. But all that said, it just doesn't come together very well, and I feel like there's just a lot of missing puzzle pieces to this book and to this series in the biblical research, in the just what he could have done with these books and taking them back in time to these situations. Also, I just gotta say, the 10 plagues are a pretty scary thing to put kids through in a story like this, and I feel like the weight of that is not really explored, especially when they introduced Pharaoh's daughter. And in the biblical story, this is a spoiler for the book of Exodus, I guess, but in the biblical story, the last plague is the firstborn of all the sons of Egypt die. And so if they do not have the blood of a lamb over their doorpost, when they first meet Pharaoh's daughter, I kept thinking, well, this is going to be interesting because we know from the passages in Exodus that according to that passage, Pharaoh had a son. So I was thinking, how is this going to play out? Like, are we going to meet the brother? Are we going to just leave her behind and not deal with the ramifications of the last plague when she is really painted as a friend to these 2 characters? She brings them into the palace and hangs out with them, and they play together and do all these things together. And that is just not really addressed. I think here's my thought about this series as a whole from the 3 books that I have read out of all 10, to be fair. I've only read 3. But I think that in the haste to explain a Bible story and to help kids learn about these stories, M.J. Thomas didn't think through all the ramifications of these stories. But biblical stories, just as kind of an aside, some of them are pretty intense. There's a lot going on in a lot of those stories. And to kind of just move past that quickly, I feel like is a little bit of a problem. Of course, you don't want to go into like all the details if they're like gory details or things like that with young kids, which these books are aimed at. But I also feel like it doesn't really share the ramifications of those stories and help kids to understand that these stories have a lot at stake in them, that there is a lot going on. And stories like Noah's Ark is not just a happy floating zoo story. And the Hebrews leaving Egypt is not just a, great escape and run away and everything's fine. But a lot of people die in that story in the Bible. And off screen, off page in this book, they do as well. So, and to not really wrestle with that at all, but just to present it very flat and just kind of at face value, I think is not really handling the story subject matter with the deft and care that it needs, as well as like working with kids who are reading these books and devouring them and helping them to have that little bit of a gravitas about what has happened in these stories. So this might be coming from my perspective as a children's pastor, and I am a children's pastor, so I talk about these stories a lot, and I've studied these stories a lot, so I spent a lot of time with them. And so I think that this series is just a little bit disappointing that way. Now, like I said, though, the writing is a lot better in this book. And M.J. Thomas's action scenes are pretty well done. And he comes up with some clever ideas and some fun things for them to explore. Like the opening sequences of this book were some of the best out of all 3, where they're inside a pyramid and there's a jackal there. And that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that part of the book. It's just this overarching fitting in the biblical narrative into these stories that I think is a problem. The other thing that's interesting is he does mention in the very back of the book that he condensed the timeline presented in Exodus in this book. So the timeline of events in Exodus is a lot longer played out than what happens here, and there are some things skipped, which some people who really like these kinds of books are real sticklers for sticking exactly to the story from the Bible and not changing a thing about it. So this book exists in a very weird space in my mind, and is a book that is very difficult, I think, to market and to have as a book series for kids that doesn't address all the things that maybe it should address, at least at the level of kids that are reading these books. So these books just kind of gloss over any sort of thing that is difficult, but then also at the same time is very blunt about other things, especially about the end of this story where, sorry, this is a spoiler for Exodus again, but Pharaoh does not live through what happens at the end of the story. And it just sort of like says that and moves on. And there's no wrestling with that. There's no thoughts about it. There's no, poignancy about it. It just is. And I think that is probably the biggest weakness of this book series. There's no grappling with the stories on a level that the kids that these books are aimed at could interact with. So, this has been an interesting series to read. Like I said, I did not enjoy reading them, but I didn't love them, and I don't think I'm going to continue reading the series. So this is the end, probably, for me, of The Secret of the Hidden Scrolls. So at the end of the day, I would give this book a 2.5 out of 5 stars. Like I said, it has some moments, but overall, I think it just doesn't grapple with the subject matter. And maybe this kind of time-traveling Bible story fiction book is not a book that should be aimed at this level of reader. I think that perhaps this should be more of a middle grade idea, and taking middle grade kids through these kinds of stories at that level might be a better thing to do, because you can grapple with a lot more at a middle grade level than you can at a early reader level. So that's my thoughts on The Secret of the Hidden Scrolls, The Great Escape, book number 3. Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Let me know in the comments down below, and until next time, everybody, keep reading. Bye.